Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway and welcome to another review. I've had today's loco for years, but I've never reviewed it or showed it properly, so today it's time to change that. Today's locomotive then is this. It is the Collett goods locomotive by Bachmann. This particular version of the model was from Bachmann's 2011 catalogue, but the model itself dates back long before that. It actually came out for the first time in 1978 under the mainline Palitoy brand, and you can see one behind me there. That is one of the mainline versions of the model. However, when Bachmann acquired the mainline models, they bought it back in 1998 with a new chassis. And then, as I understand it, they brought it back again in 2007 with an updated chassis, which included a DCC socket, etc. And along the way, they made some very superficial improvements to the loco body itself, although as far as I can tell, they didn't change it in any major way. So in today's video, I'm going to review this model from Bachmann for you because I never have done, but I'm also going to be comparing it with the original mainline version of the model to see how it's changed. This particular model I bought in 2018, I think, and the price on the box says £57.75, but I bought it physically from a vendor who knocked it down to £50 for me, which was a pretty good price. And of course today, a Bachmann model in a modern box like this for £50 sounds almost ludicrous, doesn't it? So let's see what this is like. I can't remember very much about it, which probably means it wasn't that impressive, but let's find out. And you just know that this is going to be interesting, don't you? When this particular version of the model was released, the model dated back almost 35 years. Reviewing it now in 2023, this model is more like 45 years old. So how is it going to hold up against more modern locos? We will find out. Let me show you the end of the box then. So the product code for this is 32-311. It is a Collett goods loco number 2259, and it is in the BR black with the early emblem on it. And yes, it is DCC ready with an 8-pin DCC socket. The livery though is a bit unfortunate, isn't it? It's a very plain black, which contrasts with the 1970s mainline loco in its lovely lined green. Now, I don't know if Bachmann ever did a lined green version of this from 2007 or around that era. I've seen an unlined green version of the model, which looks a little bit nicer, but not a lined one. Maybe they did one, I haven't seen it. That's quite unfortunate, isn't it? Because a nice intricate livery can hide a lack of detail in an older model, but this one I've got here is plain black. There's nothing at all to distract from the old moulding. So how's it going to look? We'll have to find out. Let me show you the back of the box then, because there is a brief history on the Collett goods, so pause and read that if you want to, although I will talk more about those in just a second. For now though, let's take this model out and let's find out how it differs from the original mainline one. Alright, here goes. There you go. So it's a little tiny loco, very similar to the Dean Goods locomotive that I've looked at more recently anyway on the channel. So yeah, we'll see how it compares to that as well, I guess, as a similar model. And let's pull out the paperwork and have a look and see if we can learn more about the chassis, because that is something that does not date back to the 1970s. And here it is. Yeah, you can see we've got the exploded diagram. Interestingly, the DCC decoder socket is in the locomotive and not the tender. And if I remember correctly, there's no electrical connection between the loco and the tender in any way. So no tender pickups, and you're cramming the decoder into the loco at the expense of some weight. And yeah, it's got a CAN motor, not your mainline pancake motor, and then a fairly traditional pickup solution with actual pickups and not a split chassis. So very different from the mainline version mechanically. And is there anything else of interest? I think this is just a guarantee. Yeah, it is. What's this then? Collector's Club. Okay, we don't need that. Right, let's see what you actually get in the pack then. I can see some accessories. Let's pull these out and have a look. Looks like 2 bags. Well, let's have a look at the first one. So the first one is simple enough, just brake rigging. And the original mainline version of the Collett class did not have any brake rigging. There wasn't actually space for it on that chassis. Obviously, on the model we're looking at today, it does have a completely new chassis, so they were able to design some brake rigging into it. So that's pretty good. What's in the other detail pack? It's very sparse actually, but there are proper screw-link couplings, at least there's one, I guess for the front of the loco, maybe for the tender, vacuum pipe, and also some grey, that's an interesting colour, fireman's tools. Again, nothing like this was supplied with the mainline version. I think there was perhaps a vacuum pipe, but certainly not fireman's tools and certainly not a moving screw-link coupling. So already we're starting to see one or two upgrades. Let's take a look at the loco herself then. Here we go. What's the finish like? Well, to be fair, I'm quite distracted from the finish by the very, very nasty looking moulding line that goes right across the top of the loco. That is something that you just don't see on more modern Bachmann locos, even ones from 2007 to 2011, which is when this one was made. Yeah, that is really quite distracting, and I'm pretty sure, where is it? Even the original mainline one didn't look that bad, no. Look at that, the mainline seam line across the top there, almost invisible. You can see it, but it's a lot more subtle. So the tooling then has suffered over the intervening years. Right, let's pull the tender out then, and I have to say this I don't think has anything to do with any old mainline tenders. This is much more modern, much more detailed. It's got proper metal wheels, full brake rigging, nicely detailed body complete with separately fitted parts, and the separately fitted coal load with detail underneath it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is just a Bachmann tender from another ex-Great Western loco or something like that, because the original mainline tender, if I just bring that in, is completely different. I mean, I think this is a Collett tender. I'm not sure exactly what this new Bachmann one is. But yeah, they are clearly quite different, yes, in their design, but also in their level of detail and I guess weight and quality as well. So there's that. Let's take a look at the locomotive, which is quite a light thing, really. Here it is, yeah, the Bachmann Collett class. And yeah, it's quite lightweight. They haven't upgraded the running plate or anything to be metal, so yeah, it's not a heavy loco at all. The wheels look a lot nicer than on the mainline version, if I bring that in. Yeah, you can see those are much finer and they've got spokes going right the way through, although the coupling rods don't look much different, frankly. Yeah, not much finer, I would say. But generally speaking, the chassis itself looks much better on this version. And let me hold the tender with it as well. Yeah, really grating that a loco from 2011 doesn't have an electrical connection to its tender at all. Most locos from this period, particularly Hornby ones, were much, much better in that regard. Yeah, that makes it really quite nasty in my opinion, and of course the loco then is having to do all of the picking up by itself. Anyway, we'll talk more about the mechanism of this thing later on. For now though, let's have a bit of background on the Collett class. The Collett Goods class, or the GWR 2251 class, was made up of 120 060 tender locos built between 1930 and 1947 to the design of Charles Collett. As the name suggests, the class was intended for goods work and medium-powered goods work at that. They were introduced as a replacement to the earlier Dean Goods locomotives, as I've mentioned, which at the time were approaching 50 years old in design and were in desperate need of an upgrade. The Collett shared many of the key dimensions and design elements of the Dean Goods, but heavily modernised with tapered boilers, fully enclosed cabs and higher pressure boilers, capable of delivering much more power to the cylinders. The class was produced right up until the end of the grouping era in 1947, when production finally stopped. The entire class continued to operate under BR ownership until 1958, when the first withdrawal was made. Today though, only one example has been preserved, while the rest were cut up and scrapped. So there it is, up close and personal for you, the upgraded Collett class from Bachmann, circa 2011 approximately. Now you would think that if Bachmann brought back a model 35 years after it first came out, that the newest version of the model would be considerably better than the original. And in some ways it is. I mean, the chassis is no doubt a lot better than the original mainline chassis. But in many ways this is not better than the mainline version. In fact, in some ways it's considerably worse. I've already talked about the horrifying seam line across the top of the loco, but I will show it you now a little bit more closely. Yeah, really distracting, completely unacceptable really. If we look at the original mainline one from the 1970s, it's far less noticeable. I would say even by modern standards, that is not far from acceptable. Why did Bachmann think that it was okay to send models out in this state? That is crazy. Another major downgrade on the later Bachmann version is the weight. This loco is considerably lighter than the mainline one. If we take the locos on their own without the tenders, the Bachmann model weighs 158 grams, the mainline model weighs in at 202 grams, so it's around 30% heavier. And I think the main reason for that is that quite a lot of the chassis has been cut away, taken out, in order to make room to have the DCC decoder in the loco. Honestly, I don't know why they've done that. Obviously, they deemed it cheaper than running wires to the tender and having the decoder in there. So I can see why Bachmann would have preferred to have done it that way, saved them some money. Not sure how many customers would have preferred it done this way though. If we add the tenders into the mix though, it's even more amusing because the weights are closer. So the Bachmann model with its tender comes in at 239 grams and the mainline one is a much closer 264 grams. So the difference now is only 10% rather than 30% before. And that means that Bachmann in their infinite wisdom have made the loco lighter and the tender heavier, which is the opposite of what you want in a loco. And I think the reason for that is the heavy die-cast coal load in the new Bachmann tender. I've never understood why they do this. That die-cast coal load is incredibly heavy and all it does is add a lot of drag, add a lot of extra work for the loco to do, and that's before it's even coupled to any rolling stock. So a genuinely silly locomotive in my opinion. In terms of livery, there are some downgrades as well. I mean, there's a subjective element to this because I do prefer the BR green with the lining to the plain BR black, but you do lose the lovely copper coloured chimney. On the mainline version, it was real copper, and while the Bachmann chimney is made of metal still, as per this livery, it is just painted plain black, which is unfortunate. Also on the mainline Collett class, the running numbers on the side of the cab had some relief to them. It made them look like they were real separate number plates. On the later Bachmann version, for some reason, they've taken that relief out of the plate, so it's just flat to the loco body. That's not as realistic, is it? It must have made the loco easier to decorate because otherwise I don't see why they would have done that. And they certainly didn't include any etched versions of these plates either. So in my opinion, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say that is a downgrade. Let's talk about some of the differences though. The buffers are considerably different. The Bachmann version, these buffers look a lot more Great Western than the Collett class buffers do. The Bachmann version has had a few little handrails added onto the running plate, and there are one or two areas on the body that have just been tweaked very slightly to improve their finesse. The cab windows, for instance, now have glazing in them, whereas they were left unglazed on the mainline version. And there's also a rather nice die-cast cab piece that has been inserted into the Bachmann version, which was new to the Bachmann version of the model. The mainline version had nothing like that. You just look into the cab of that loco and see the chassis. They've also upgraded the chunky plastic handrails in the cab to separately fitted wire ones, which make them look a little more subtle. However, these upgrades are not enough, in my opinion, to make this loco look modern and decent, even by 2011 standards. For example, there's still no valve gear between the frames, and this is a very high boilered loco, which exposes the lack of detail quite massively. The pipework and such is still just a part of the moulding on this loco, and if we look over on the other side, the reverser rod is still conspicuously unrealistic because it is just a part of the moulding. The same is true for the smoke box door. Again, the smoke box dart here is just a part of the moulding, and it is kind of obvious that that's the case. The lamp brackets above the front buffer beam as well, very, very chunky, nasty looking things. I don't think the original mainline one even had those, but yeah, these don't look great. Buffer beam detail looks okay. Again, it's got new buffers on it, so that's a bit better. The buffers are made of metal, but they are not sprung, although I guess that's kind of forgivable this time because obviously they are so fine. And unlike the mainline big chunky couplings, this has finally had an upgrade to NEM. That comes from the fact though that this has a new chassis. Obviously the coupling is not connected to the body here. The safety valve bonnet is still a relatively chunky and unrealistic looking piece, so no change there. And the whistles do look pretty good. These are made of metal and they are very fine, and I would say they are the same piece as on the mainline version. Yeah, they were pretty good before and they still look fine here. I should note as well though that the cab detail is unpainted. Yeah, so while there is some detail there, it's a bit half-baked in the fact that they didn't decide to paint it. That would have made a really big difference, I think. In terms of the chassis though, like I say, the cast wheels are a lot better than the plastic-centered metal-tired wheels on mainlines, which were quite chunky. Yeah, this looked way better, and obviously with the brake rigging, you'd add quite a bit more detail here too. Let's have a look at the tender, which is objectively quite a lot better than the mainline tender. The finish is a lot better, and in fact you can tell that this tender doesn't really belong to this loco because it is completely different in its finish. It also has a separately fitted metal tender full plate, painted cab controls, very fine wheels with some finely moulded axle boxes and springs. We've already talked about the coal load, which is silly because it's metal and doesn't need to be, but it has more detail in it at least. And around the back you've got separately fitted handrails, separately fitted lamp brackets this time, and a similarly detailed buffer beam which you could add even more detail to improve if you wanted. So it's a pretty naff model overall, I think, and I would say that it's very unlikely that we will see Bachmann bring this model back without some upgrades, because realistically this model is not going to be available for 50-something pounds like it was back in the day. I don't think there are any Bachmann locos that are that cheap, and so if they charged even £100 for this, frankly, it would be too much given the basic level of detail and the incredibly simple and poor quality mechanism and chassis that we're about to see. So this is really not a loco that I would recommend picking up second hand, and frankly the mainline versions of this model are significantly cheaper. They are worse overall because they don't have the cab detail and the other minor upgrades, and obviously the chassis is much worse, but my mainline Collett cost me sort of £20 to £30, something like that, not 50 like this one did. Is there really £20+ worth of improvements here? Well, it's not entirely clear. Anyway, let's move on. Let's take a look at the mechanism and also the performance. So there it is, the Bachmann Collett class down onto the track. The 1970s mainline body with a more modern Bachmann chassis and tender. A very, very interesting loco. Before we get on to performance then, let's talk a little bit about the mechanism. Some of it I've briefly mentioned already, so I apologise for any brief repetition. First things first, no tender pickups. Obviously no tender pickups because there's no connection at all electrically between the loco and the tender. That means that the loco is just relying on its driving wheel pickups, and there's one of those per wheel. So you've got 3 pickups per line, that's it. That's quite below average. You've also got this really annoying drawbar between the loco and the tender. It's a really infuriating design. It's quite hard to keep these two coupled together while you put the loco on the track. And that's because the peg that goes through the hole is very shallow and it can very easily slip out of the loop. There's also this hinged piece which moves side to side, and again it's quite hard to get that engaged when the loco is the right way up. The loco's base keeper plate is held on with 4 screws, and the pickups are hardwired to this base keeper plate, which prevents the full removal of the base for easy servicing, so that's not ideal. And underneath there, again, not ideal, no proper bearings on these driving axles, although they do sit into circular slots as opposed to square ones, as we sometimes see from Bachmann. You've got the rear axle driven, so it's just a single axle drive by a motor which is mounted vertically, and you can see the worm drive there, so this is all the mechanism is. You can get to it all from the base, which is pretty interesting. It does mean that you don't really have to remove the body, but if you want to, you have to undo the front screw underneath the front coupling and then the rear screw, and that allows you to pull the chassis out of the body. This is an interesting piece. This is the cab detail piece that Bachmann made. This was never a part of the mainline model, and that kind of just slips into the loco body. Made of metal, lots of weight to it, so that it adds to the loco's weight. Not much, but yeah, it certainly adds to it. And yeah, the chassis then screws into that piece. And here is the chassis. It's a very bare bones die-cast chassis. Here's the motor with no flywheel. Not sure whether it's a 3 or a 5-pole motor, but it certainly doesn't perform well at slow speeds. And then here is your 8-pin DCC decoder socket, in front of which is the hollow boiler, which allows you some room for a decoder. That explains why the loco is so light. I think if they'd have put the decoder socket in the tender, then that whole boiler could have been metal filled, and obviously the loco would have been much heavier, but for whatever reason they cheaped out and just kept the electricals in the loco. And then in terms of gauge, it comes in at 14.2 quite reliably between all of the driving axles, which is just comfortably below the standard. So there you have it. That is the mechanism. Certainly not very impressive, and to say they had an opportunity to modernise the chassis, build something new and high quality, it's such a shame that they missed that opportunity and created something as cheaply as possible, which resulted in quite a nasty chassis. The pulling power as a result of the loco's light weight is not that impressive, 0.2 newtons, which should be around 15 coaches on straight and level track. And in light of that, I've set up a reasonably hefty freight train with some mixed wagons, and we'll see how she gets on with those in just a second. First though, let's have a go with this loco in motion. Let's see if it works. I have been testing this and warming it up, so it should be in a fairly good shape. As you can see, it's a beautifully smooth runner, really nice and smooth. It's now going over the points, and to be fair to it, it did not cut out. Now that's because I do take care of my locos, and every once in a while I do clean this loco's wheels and pickups, and that's very necessary because if those get dirty, you haven't got lots of pickups in the tender to pick up the slack. So yeah, it's well worth maintaining these. Let me show you the gearing. Let's go past at 50% speed. Are you ready? So yeah, certainly a little bit speedy. But the torque is great if I remember correctly. Let me demonstrate that. Put my fingers in front, start it off at not too great a speed. Yeah, look at that. It's able to fight my finger. And if I go up to 50, yeah, I mean, look at that. Power to spare, which is great. But because it is geared to run quite fast, I don't have high hopes for the crawl. So let's see what that's like. I'm going to just ease it up very gently. I am turning up, turning up. I saw a bit of a jerk. Is it going to go any more? I'm still turning. Yeah, that's as slow as it goes. Now that's interesting because it doesn't ever go through a period of jerkiness. It goes from stopped to smooth immediately. Unfortunately, it doesn't pass through a crawl section on that journey, which is unfortunate. But yeah, it is smooth at all speeds, that is true, but unfortunately it cannot crawl. So I'm guessing this is probably a 3-pole motor, but I'm not sure. I'm just going to try and sort of slow down into a crawl. Yeah, and as you can see, it can't. I'm going to help it along. Yeah, it just doesn't have the torque to maintain it, unfortunately. So we've certainly seen better models from Bachmann. I think if it had a better, chunkier motor with proper bearings as well on the axles and better gearing, then there would be sufficiently little friction and enough torque to make this thing a better crawler. But unfortunately, it's not. Right, let's go and couple up to the freight train then and see what the pulling power's like. Here we go. I'm going pretty much as slowly as I can, so I'm going to struggle to, yeah, it's hard, really hard to get a smooth coupling with this. And as a goods engine, that's not that impressive. Anyway, let's see if it can handle this load. Try and do a nice smooth start if possible. Yeah, not really possible, just kind of starts. And with lots of wagons coupled, that's even more noticeable because they all kind of jerk. But yeah, it is what it is. Once it's started, as you can see, beautifully nice and smooth. So I do think it's fair to say that the performance on this Bachmann Collett isn't great. However, it is much, much better than on the old mainline Collett, which I'm running on the middle line for you. The Bachmann is running at 35 speed, and this is running at 65 speed, and yet the speed is about the same, so it shows you how much more efficient the more modern Bachmann mechanism is. These mainline locos can run nicely and a lot of people speak very highly of them. In my opinion though, they're a bit more trouble than they're worth. They do need a lot of maintenance and those motors can be quite finicky. Although it's having a better go at crawling than the Bachmann one did. Anyway, it's got some coaches because I think the BR Green suits passenger coaches a bit better. And then on the inside line, I've got the loco that these two were based on, and that's the much earlier pre-grouping Dean Goods locomotive. And here it comes. There you go, and see which other 060s you can spot on the layout. There is one odd one out, and if you comment down below if you spot it, I might pin you. Alright, here we go, Bachmann Collett with a goods train, and there's quite a few wagons here, quite a heavy train, what with the Hatton's Warwell in there. And as you can see, around that curve without any slowing down whatsoever, which is quite impressive. So the torque in the mechanism at the higher speeds is fantastic, which suggests a very good and powerful motor in this loco. That power doesn't really manifest at the low speeds, unfortunately, so yeah, the crawl, not fantastic. But at anything above a crawl, it is really a model performer, which is unexpected, and this happens quite a bit. These really shoddy mechanisms quite often do perform well from Bachmann, particularly these older ones from 10 plus years ago. Don't know how it's possible really. I'm guessing it's just a damn good motor at the end of the day. But regardless of the reason, it's a marvellous performer at the higher speeds, and definitely, as I say, a big improvement over the mainline chassis. So at last we've got something that is well worth shouting about on this loco, the performance. I think more modern, more expensive Bachmann locos do perform better than this, because they can match this in terms of performance at the higher speeds, but the difference with those is that they can crawl really well too, and obviously this one can't. So yeah, performance is so-so, certainly very good at the higher speeds. The loco doesn't look great up close, although from a distance it is passable here, although I must say I do miss the lining that this livery takes away from me. And so overall it's hard to say which I prefer, you know, this or the mainline version. The mainline version runs more poorly, but in terms of detail it's not that much different. I guess it doesn't have a detailed cab, but the Bachmann one doesn't really. I mean, it's got the detail there, but it's not picked out. So it's still just a dark blank space as far as you're concerned as it runs past. So, you know, ultimately, because I don't mind maintaining it, I guess I'd rather take the mainline one with the lining and the lack of horrible moulding line across the top of the boiler. But yeah, there's no clear winner, and I would say that the updated, in inverted commas, Bachmann version is really not that much better than the original, which is quite surprising, isn't it? Let's have some ratings then for the Collett goods from Bachmann. Now, the level of detail I've decided to give an unprecedentedly low score of 1 star. Now, sometimes when I review vintage models, I might caveat it and say, well, you know, back when this was designed, they didn't have the same level of detail as models do now, but Bachmann brought this model out after loads of improvements had been made throughout the industry, and yet here was the Collett goods in this state just over 10 years ago. So it is a 1 star for me. Moulding lines across the top of the body, moulded detail that is quite chunky, no sprung buffers, no painted cab detail, no valve gear between the frames, no proper nameplates for the side of the cab. Yeah, it's a very, very basic model. There's nothing really about the level of detail that I can praise. I guess the tender was okay, but yeah, not the loco. Performance though is pretty good, I would say. Besides the fact that it can't crawl, it's a marvellous performer. Lots of torque, lots of power around the curves as well, with no slowing down up the incline either. I've had to knock it down a little bit because it can't crawl, it really is poor at the low speeds, but at the high speeds, absolutely fine, so that's 3.5 star. Pulling power is about average, I would say, for an 060, 15 coaches or 0.2 newtons. That's more than a Hornby J15, but less than an Oxford J27. Yeah, there's about an equal number of 060s that are both more powerful and weaker than this, so it's middle of the road. Mechanism though is just a 2 star for me, quite a disappointing mechanism. No tender pickups, in fact no connection to the tender electrically of any kind. Fussy loco to tender drawbar, which is a right pain to use. No proper bearings on the loco. Lightweight chassis because the decoder socket is in the loco and not the tender. And no flywheel on the motor as well. Does seem to be a fairly good quality motor though, so I've given it a couple of stars for that. The quality on the whole is so-so. I've given it a middle of the road 3-star. All plastic construction on the body, which is a shame. A die-cast running plate would have made the loco much heavier, and it would benefit from that because it's really quite lightweight. It's also got the moulding lines on the top, which obviously detracts from the quality. Apart from that though, it has been put together to a high standard. I didn't see any visible glue or anything like that, so credit where credit's due. Value for money you should take with a pinch of salt, because I don't know what the RRP was for this back in 2011. I found people on forums talking about buying this loco for 50 something pounds, and that tallies with what I paid for this. I paid £50 for this. So it certainly doesn't sound as though it was too expensive. If anything, 2011, that would have made this quite a decent budget option. So it doesn't sound as though Bachmann were really ripping people off with this, although again, I don't know exactly what the RRP was. If Bachmann were to bring this back, do I think they would make this a budget offering that was affordable for people? Well, I'm sure it would be cheaper than some of their offerings, but usually these old models that Bachmann bring out, a modern example is the 2MT, they're not really that far away from their other models in price. So yeah, I think if Bachmann were to bring this back, this would be more expensive than would be reasonable. But I've given it 4-star for the £50 I paid, absolutely fine. Overall then, that is quite a disappointing score of 5.39 out of 10, dragged down mainly by the poor level of detail. That's a grade of E, and into the logbook it goes, where it is 31st place, not too far from the bottom, certainly the bottom 5, below the J94 from EFE Rail, and above the Royal Remembrance train set. Well folks, that will just about do it for this review. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do comment down below and let me know what you think of this. And also let me know, have you got one of these? Were you able to find a more recent Bachmann version of this model that did have the lining? Because that is something I would be interested in. I suppose another big question is, could I take the body from my mainline Collett and put it on this chassis and make a, an ultimate Bachmann Collett? Yeah, I think so. I think possibly the body mountings do seem to be the same as on the old mainline version. So yeah, that would totally be an option. That way you would get the slightly better body. I guess you could even put the cab detail piece in there. Again, I don't see any reason why that wouldn't fit. So I guess Bachmann have given us the tools to create the ultimate Collett class, even though it sounds like they never sold the ultimate Collett class all in one go. But again, if they did do one that was decorated to the highest modern standards with the lining and everything, then I guess I would change my mind on that. But either way, that will just about do it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you very, very soon for another one. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.